17th of June, Saturday. The Bensons were eager to start their new life in the quiet town of Ravenswood. John and Lisa, along with their teenage daughter Emily, had moved from the bustling city to this remote village in search of peace and a slower pace of life. They bought an old, sprawling farmhouse on the outskirts, nestled near dense woods that seemed to promise tranquility and privacy. The house was a fixer-upper, but its rustic charm and potential captivated them. However, from the moment they arrived, an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. The previous owners had left in a hurry, leaving behind furniture, personal items, and an eerie silence. The house, with its creaking floors and whispering walls, felt like it was hiding something. That first night, as they settled into their new home, the wind howled through the old, drafty windows, and the trees outside seemed to reach out with gnarled branches. Emily, always the skeptic, laughed at her parents' unease, claiming it was just an old house with old noises. But as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her room was at the end of a long hallway, and in the darkness, the shadows seemed to twist and move. She heard faint whispers, almost like a distant conversation, but when she strained to listen, the voices faded away. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams of shadowy figures and a cold, suffocating darkness that seemed to press down on her. Over the next few days, the Bensons began to notice strange occurrences. Lights flickered without reason. Objects seemed to move on their own. John, ever the rational one, dismissed it as electrical issues and the quirks of an old house settling. But Lisa felt an unease that she couldn't explain. One evening, as she was unpacking boxes in the attic, she stumbled upon an old chest. Inside, she found a collection of worn, conic leather-bound journals. They belonged to the house's original owner, a man named Samuel Blackwood. His entries spoke of a prosperous farm and a happy family, but as the years went on, the tone grew darker. Samuel wrote of strange noises in the night, of seeing figures moving in the woods, and of a creeping sense of dread that permeated the house. Lisa's curiosity turned to fear as she read the final entries, where Samuel detailed the disappearance of his wife and children. In his desperate attempts to find them, his last entry was a frantic scrawl, barely legible, mentioning the darkness beneath and the whispers of the damned. That night, Lisa shared the journals with John, and though he tried to reassure her, the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Emily, overhearing the conversation, dismissed it as old superstitions and ghost stories. She couldn't deny the chill that ran down her spine. One stormy night, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. John went to the basement to check the fuse box, but as he descended the stairs, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was cold and damp, and the flickering beam of his flashlight revealed strange symbols etched into the walls. As he approached the fuse box, he heard a low, guttural growl, and the temperature dropped sharply. John spun around, but there was nothing there. Quickly fixed the fuse and hurried back upstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't tell Lisa or Emily about the symbols or the growl, not wanting to alarm them, but the experience left him shaken. Over the next few days, the occurrences grew more frequent and more violent. Doors would slam shut on their own, and the whispers became louder, more insistent. Emily began having nightmares of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with glowing red eyes. She would wake up screaming, her body drenched in cold sweat, but whenever her parents checked, there was nothing there. Lisa, too, began to feel the presence, especially when she was alone in the house. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, and the feeling of being watched was constant. Desperate for answers, Lisa delved deeper into the history of the house and the town. She discovered that Samuel Blackwood had been accused of practicing dark rituals, and that his family had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Townspeople believed the house was cursed, and that Samuel had opened a doorway to another realm, allowing malevolent entities to enter. Lisa shared her findings with John, and though he was skeptical, couldn't deny the strange occurrences. One evening, as they were discussing their next steps, they heard Emily's terrified screams from upstairs. They rushed to her room and found her standing in the middle of the floor, staring at the wall in horror. There, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "Get out." Emily was hysterical. claiming that she had seen the shadowy figure writing the message while she was frozen in place, unable to move. John and Lisa, now truly frightened, decided to leave the house that night. As they tried to gather their belongings, the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut, trapping them inside, and the whispers grew into deafening roars. Trapped and terrified, the Bensons decided to confront the darkness head-on. John remembered the strange symbols in the basement and believed they might hold the key to stopping the entity. Armed with candles and the journals, they descended into the basement. The air was thick with an oppressive darkness, and the growling noise was louder, more menacing. They traced the symbols with their fingers, and as they did, the doorway began to materialize in the wall, portal to a place of unspeakable horror. From the portal emerged the shadowy figure, its form shifting and writhing, eyes glowing with malevolence. It lunged at them. They held their ground, reciting the words they had found in Samuel's journal. The entity screamed in rage, its form flickering and weakening. The house shook violently, and the symbols began to glow, emitting a blinding light. With a final, ear-splitting roar, the entity was sucked back into the portal, which closed with a thunderous crash. The house fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting. The Bensons, exhausted and shaken, made their way upstairs. They packed what they could and left the house, vowing never to return. Weeks passed since the Bensons left the farmhouse, and the scars of their ordeal began to heal. John and Lisa tried to reclaim normalcy, focusing on their work and Emily's school. But their peace was shattered one evening when they received a call from a local historian who had been researching the Blackwood house. The historian, Dr. Evelyn Hart, had uncovered disturbing new information, suggested the darkness in Ravenswood was far from over. Dr. Hart revealed that Samuel Blackwood's rituals were part of an ancient practice aimed at summoning an entity known as the Noxus, being of pure malevolence, said to feed on fear and despair. According to local legends, the entity had been imprisoned within the house, and the disappearance of Blackwood's family was a result of a failed attempt to banish it. The historian believed that although the entity had been weakened, it was still bound to the house and could potentially return if the house's malevolent energy was not properly contained. Desperate and worried, the Bensons agreed to help Dr. Hart. They returned to Ravenswood, armed with a sense of dread and determination. The house, now even more dilapidated than before, loomed ominously in the distance. The local authorities had barred access, but Dr. Hart had managed to secure a special permit for their investigation. As they approached the farmhouse, the air felt colder, and a foreboding silence enveloped. The house appeared more menacing, its windows dark and lifeless, and the once welcoming porch now seemed like a grim entrance to an abyss. Inside, the house was eerily still, the dust settling over everything like a shroud. The walls were covered in strange dark stains, and the air was heavy with an unnatural chill. Dr. Hart began her investigation, setting up various instruments to measure electromagnetic fields and detect any supernatural activity. As they moved through the house, they encountered a series of increasingly disturbing phenomena. Lights flickered erratically, doors banged shut with deafening crashes, and strange whispers filled the air, growing louder and more insistent. The shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, shifting and twisting as if they were alive. In the basement, the symbols that John and Lisa had seen before were now glowing faintly. Dr. Hart began to decipher their meaning, revealing that they were ancient sigils used to trap and contain entities of darkness. The presence of the Noxus had weakened the seals, allowing its influence to seep through. The historian concluded that to prevent the entity from escaping, they needed to reinforce the wards and seal the portal once and for all. As night fell, the farmhouse grew increasingly chaotic. The temperature plummeted, and a howling wind seemed to emanate from within the walls. Dr. Hart led John and Lisa into the basement, where the air was thick with an oppressive energy. The portal, which had remained closed for weeks, began to flicker ominously, and the shadowy figure of the Noxus appeared, its form more defined and sinister than before. The entity's eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its presence seemed to warp reality around it. It roared with fury, its voice a cacophony of anguished screams and guttural growls. The house shook violently, and the walls cracked as the Noxus fought to break free from its prison. Dr. Hart, despite her fear, worked tirelessly to reinforce the wards, chanting ancient incantations and drawing symbols in a desperate bid to contain the entity. John and Lisa, terrified but resolute, helped Dr. Hart as best they could. The house was in turmoil, with objects flying through the air and the very fabric of reality bending under the strain. Emily, who had stayed outside, watched in horror as the farmhouse seemed to come alive with dark energy. She saw fleeting glimpses of the shadowy figure through the broken windows, its presence a constant reminder of the danger within. The struggle reached its climax as the Noxus unleashed its full fury. The basement was filled with a blinding light as Dr. Hart completed the final incantation. The energy surged through the room, creating a whirlwind of shadows and light. The Noxus writhed in agony, its form distorting and flickering as if it were being torn apart. The house groaned and creaked under the strain, its foundations rattling as if it were on the brink of collapse. John, Lisa, and Dr. Hart fought against the overwhelming darkness, their every effort seemingly consumed by the entity's rage. The pressure was immense, and the fear was suffocating. Emily, unable to bear it any longer, rushed into the basement, her presence a beacon of hope amidst the chaos. She threw herself into the effort, helping to stabilize the wards and recite the incantations as Dr. Hart had instructed. With a final earth-shattering roar, the Noxus was pulled back into the portal, which sealed with a deafening clang. The light intensified, and then, just as suddenly, it was over. The oppressive darkness lifted, and the house fell silent, the only sound the distant rumble of the storm outside. Exhausted and battered, the Bensons and Dr. Hart emerged from the basement. The farmhouse was in ruins, its walls cracked and its structure weakened by the recent battle. The air was still cold, but the malevolent presence had vanished. The entity had been contained, but the house was left in a state of disrepair, its dark history now a part of its very essence. The Bensons decided to leave Ravenswood for good, their ordeal having left deep emotional and psychological scars. They moved to a new town, far from the haunting memories of the farmhouse. They tried to rebuild their lives, but the experiences in Ravenswood remained a constant shadow, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. Dr. Hart continued her research, documenting the events and warning others about the dangers of tampering with forces beyond their understanding. The story of the Blackwood House became a cautionary tale, a legend of horror that echoed through the town's history. The Benson's tale was a stark reminder of the malevolent forces that could be unleashed when ancient rituals and dark energies were disturbed. Though they had survived, the darkness they faced would forever be a part of their lives, a haunting reminder of the terror that lay beneath. It was 17 July, a Saturday, when the Parkers moved into Willowbrook House. They had been desperate for a fresh start after a tumultuous year that had left their family fragmented and strained. Tom and Sarah, along with their 2 children, Lily and Max, hoped that the isolated Victorian mansion on the outskirts of a small town would provide the peace and tranquility they so desperately needed. The house, with its ornate woodwork and sprawling grounds, seemed like a dream come true, a place where they could rebuild their lives and leave the past behind. But from the moment they stepped through the door, a palpable sense of dread washed over them. The house creaked and groaned, its ancient timbers settling with eerie regularity, as if the very structure were alive. Shadows seemed to dance in the corners, and the wind howled through the old, drafty windows with a mournful wail. Tom and Sarah tried to dismiss these unsettling sensations as mere quirks of an old house, but Lily and Max were not so easily convinced. That night, as they settled into their new home, Lily pointed out muddy footprints leading from the front door up the grand staircase. They seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, their edges blurred and indistinct, as if the person who made them had materialized out of thin air. Tom tried to brush it off, insisting it must have been one of them tracking in dirt. But deep down, he felt a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Later, as they lay in bed, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps outside their bedroom door. They were slow, deliberate, and growing closer with each passing second. She nudged Tom awake, her heart pounding in her chest. but by the time he got up to check, the hallway was empty, save for the lingering echo of those ghostly steps. The next day, as the family tried to settle into their new routines, Lily began complaining about hearing whispers in her room at night. He described them as soft, urgent voices that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Tom and Sarah reassured her, saying it was probably just the wind, or perhaps the old pipes settling. But Max, usually the fearless one, started to refuse to go into the basement altogether. He said he saw a man standing in the corner, watching him with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. When Tom went down to investigate, he found nothing out of the ordinary, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. As the days passed, the incidents became more frequent and more disturbing. Objects would move on their own, sliding across tables or falling from shelves with no apparent cause. Doors would creak open in the middle of the night, and cold spots would appear in the hallways, sending shivers down their spine. One evening, while cleaning out the attic, Sarah discovered an old leather-bound diary hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. The entries belonged to a woman named Elizabeth, who had lived in the house decades ago. Her writings were increasingly erratic, filled with fear and paranoia about a dark entity that haunted her and her child. The final entry was smeared with what looked like blood, ending abruptly with the chilling words, "It's here." That night, Sarah dreamt of Elizabeth, her face twisted in terror, warning her to leave the house. When she woke up, the room was icy cold, and a shadowy figure stood at the foot of the bed, its presence suffused with an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Sarah screamed, waking Tom, but the figure vanished as soon as the light came on, leaving them both shaken and terrified. Max's behavior grew increasingly erratic as the days turned into weeks. He would stare off into space, mumbling to himself, and his once cheerful demeanor became sullen and withdrawn. He talked about the Shadow Man more frequently, describing him in chilling detail. A tall, gaunt figure with eyes that glowed like embers and a mouth twisted into a cruel, mocking grin. One evening, while Sarah was making dinner, Max wandered off. They found him in the basement, standing in front of the old, iron-bound door, his eyes glazed over and unresponsive. When they shook him, he snapped back to reality, sobbing and saying that the Shadow Man wanted him to open the door. It was then that Tom and Sarah decided to see what lay behind it. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the house, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Armed with flashlights, Tom and Sarah descended into the unknown, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air was thick and musty, filled with the smell of decay, and strange symbols were scrawled on the walls, their meanings lost to time. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small, windowless room. In the center stood an old cradle, and beside it lay a rusted locket. Sarah picked it up and opened it, revealing a faded photograph of Elizabeth and her baby. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and their flashlights flickered. A shadowy figure appeared in the corner, its eyes glowing with malevolence. Tom and Sarah backed away slowly, their breath visible in the frigid air. As the figure moved closer, its presence suffused with a palpable sense of evil. They slammed the door shut and ran up the stairs, figure's hollow eyes seared into their memories. Determined to uncover the truth about their home, Sarah visited the local library and unearthed the house's grim history. She discovered that Elizabeth had lost her infant son under mysterious circumstances, and that she had vanished shortly after. The townsfolk whispered about dark rituals and the house being cursed, its walls soaked with the blood and tears of those who had suffered within. Sarah realized that the dark entity haunting their home was the embodiment of the pain and suffering that had taken place within those walls, a malevolent spirit feeding off the fear and despair of its inhabitants. That night, as she shared her findings with Tom, the house seemed to come alive, its walls creaking and groaning as if in protest. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the shadowy figure appeared again, this time more distinct and more menacing. It lunged at them with a guttural roar, sending objects flying across the room and shattering the windows with its fury. They barely escaped with their lives, fleeing to the relative safety of the living room, where they huddled together, terrified and exhausted. The activity in the house grew more violent with each passing day. Doors slammed shut with such force that the wood splintered, and Lily was thrown across her room by an unseen force, leaving bruises on her arms. The whispers had become screams, echoing through the halls at all hours of the day and night, filling their minds with dread. Tom found scratches on his arms after waking up from a nightmare where the shadowy figure was clawing it, its eyes burning with hatred. The family was at their breaking point. Their once happy home, now a living nightmare. Desperate for help, the Parkers sought the assistance of a renowned paranormal investigator. He arrived with an array of equipment and a solemn demeanor, warning them that what they were dealing with was not just a ghost, but a malevolent entity that thrived on fear and suffering. The investigator set up cameras and recording devices throughout the house, attempting to communicate with the entity and capture evidence of its presence. The response was immediate and violent. Objects flew across the room, smashing against the walls, and the shadowy figure manifested with a fury that shook the very foundations of the house. The investigator was thrown against the wall, barely escaping with his life, and the family was left to confront the entity on their own. Realizing that they couldn't fight this alone, Tom and Sarah made the difficult decision to destroy the hidden room. They believed it was the source of the entity's power, and that by burning it, they could break its hold on their home. Armed with gasoline and matches, they descended into the basement one last time, their hearts heavy with fear and determination. As they poured gasoline over the cradle and the strange symbols on the walls, the house seemed to scream in protest, its walls shaking and groaning as if in pain. A shadowy figure appeared, more solid and terrifying than ever, its eyes burning with an unholy light. It lunged at them with a roar of fury, but Tom managed to light a match. Setting the room ablaze, the fire spread quickly, consuming the room and everything in it. The figure writhed and screamed, its form dissolving in the flames as the house shuddered and groaned. Family barely escaped with their lives, watching from the safety of the yard as Willowbrook House burned to the ground. Fire roared, the heat intense and searing. As the flames consumed the house, the oppressive weight lifted, and the air seemed to grow lighter. In the aftermath of the fire, Parkers moved to a new town, trying to rebuild their lives once again. But the experiences they had endured left deep scars. Lily and Max had night terrors, waking up screaming in the middle of the night, their cries echoing through the halls of their new home. Tom and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had followed them, a lingering presence that watched them from the shadows. Despite their efforts to move on, the memories of Willowbrook House haunted them, a constant reminder of the horrors they had faced. They sought therapy and support, trying to heal from the trauma, but the scars remained, a testament to the malevolent forces they had battled. The story of Willowbrook House became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among the townsfolk about the dangers that lurk in the shadows past. Parkers knew they had done the right thing by destroying the house, but the price they had paid was steep, their lives forever altered by the darkness they had confronted. As they tried to move forward, they held on to each other, finding strength in their family and the hope that one day they would be free from the shadows that haunted them. On a gloomy Friday evening, Emily Walker returned home to her quaint suburban house. The week had been stressful. All she wanted was a quiet night in. As she stepped into the dimly lit foyer, she noticed an unusual silence. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost tangible, like the house itself was holding its breath. Emily shrugged it off, attributing it to her overactive imagination, and headed to the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. The kitchen was eerily quiet. The usual hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, more intrusive. As Emily poured water into the kettle, she noticed something out of place. A single, muddy footprint on the otherwise spotless tile floor. Her heart skipped a beat. She lived alone. Trying to calm her racing thoughts, she convinced herself that she must have tracked in the mud earlier without noticing. She wiped the footprint away and put the incident out of her mind. Later that night, Emily settled into the living room with a book. The house felt colder than usual, and she wrapped herself in a blanket. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Emily's eyes darted around the room. It was just a power surge, she told herself. But then, the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Emily froze. Her mind raced, and she tried to rationalize the noise. Perhaps it was just the house settling. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She reached for her phone, but it was dead. In a panic, she grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantel and crept towards the stairs. The creaking of the steps under her feet seemed to mimic her heartbeat. When she reached the top, she found nothing. The hallway was empty, and all the doors were closed. She checked each room. Everything appeared normal. Trying to shake off her unease, she returned downstairs. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next day, she went about her routine, but the sense of unease lingered. While cleaning, she found more muddy footprints leading from the front door to the basement. Emily's stomach churned. She had cleaned the floors the night before. Determined to find an explanation, she grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement. The basement was dark and damp, the air thick with an earthy smell. The beam of her flashlight danced over the cluttered space, casting long shadows. As she moved deeper into the basement, she heard a faint whisper. Emily spun around, but no one was there. She was about to turn back when she noticed a small door she had never seen before, half hidden behind old boxes. It was slightly ajar. With trembling hands, she pushed it open. Behind the door was a narrow, dimly lit passageway. The air was colder here, and Emily could see her breath. She felt a chill run down her spine, but pressed on. The passageway led to a small room, its walls lined with dusty shelves filled with old books and trinkets. In the center of the room stood an antique mirror, its glass cracked and cloudy. Emily approached the mirror, feeling an inexplicable pull. As she stood before the mirror, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned quickly. The room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, her reflection seemed off. The face staring back at her had a twisted, malevolent smile. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. The reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if trying to break free. Emily turned and fled, slamming the hidden door behind her. Emily tried to go about her life, but the events in the basement haunted her. She started seeing shadows moving in her peripheral vision and hearing whispers in empty rooms. One night as she lay in bed, she felt a cold hand brush against her cheek. She bolted upright, but no one was there. Sleep became elusive, and she felt like she was slowly losing her mind. Desperate for answers, Emily began researching the history of her house. She discovered that the previous owner, an eccentric old man, had vanished without a trace. Neighbors spoke of strange occurrences and claimed the house was cursed. Emily's heart sank. She knew she had to confront whatever was haunting her. Armed with a sense of determination, Emily returned to the hidden room in the basement. The air was colder than before, and the atmosphere felt oppressive. She approached the mirror again, her reflection twisted into a mocking grin. Summoning her courage, she spoke to the entity trapped within. "Who are you?" she demanded. The reflection's grin widened, and a voice echoed in her mind. "I am the one who dwells in the shadows, the one who watches and waits. You cannot escape me." Emily felt a surge of anger. "I won't let you control me," she shouted. The mirror began to shake, and the room filled with a deafening roar. Emily grabbed a nearby book and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, and a dark, swirling mist erupted from within. The mist coalesced into a shadowy figure, eyes glowing with malevolence. The figure lunged at Emily, but she stood her ground. She remembered a passage she had read about banishing spirits. She began to recite the incantation, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her heart. The figure screamed and writhed as the words took effect. The room shook violently, and objects flew off the shelves. Emily continued the incantation, her voice growing louder. The shadowy figure shrank and twisted, screams echoing in the confined space. With a final, piercing cry, it exploded into a cloud of dark mist and vanished. The room fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted. Emily collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. In the days that followed, the house felt lighter, almost peaceful. The whispers ceased, and the shadows no longer lurked in the corners of her vision. Emily knew she had triumphed, but the experience had changed her. She became more attuned to the supernatural, often feeling the presence of spirits around her. Despite the lingering unease, Emily decided to stay in the house. She transformed the hidden room into a sanctuary, filling it with protective charms and symbols. She vowed to never let another malevolent spirit take hold of her home. One night, as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard a faint whisper. Her heart skipped a beat, but then she realized it was a friendly voice offering a word of thanks. Previous owner, it seemed, finally found peace. Emily smiled, feeling a sense of closure. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, ready to face whatever came next. At 3 p.m. on October 7, 2024, Daniel Price, a 37-year-old travel writer, arrived at a charming cottage he had rented for a week-long retreat in the countryside. The cottage was advertised as a peaceful getaway, perfect for unwinding and writing in solitude. The listing boasted of its picturesque setting and vintage charm, but Daniel was drawn by the promise of isolation and inspiration. Upon arrival, Daniel was greeted by the property manager, a woman named Helen, who handed him the keys with a cryptic warning. "Cottage is beautiful, but it has its quirks. Just make sure to follow the house rules." Helen's tone was serious, but Daniel dismissed it as an oddity of rural life. The cottage was indeed charming, with its antique furniture, creaky wooden floors, and a cozy fireplace. However, Daniel noticed that the atmosphere was unusually heavy, as if the air itself was thick with unspoken history. The next day, Daniel began to experience strange occurrences. He woke up to find his belongings had been moved, although he was certain he had left everything in place. Items from the kitchen seemed to have been rearranged, and his manuscript pages were scattered on the floor. The atmosphere in the cottage grew increasingly oppressive. Daniel felt a persistent chill, despite the fireplace burning brightly. He began hearing faint, inexplicable noises at night. Soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the walls. Despite his attempts to dismiss it as the house settling, the sounds were unnerving. Determined to focus on his writing, Daniel decided to investigate the cottage's history. He discovered that it had once belonged to a local family that had experienced a series of tragic events. The family had lost several members under mysterious circumstances, and the cottage had been abandoned for a long time before being rented out again. On Wednesday, Daniel's experiences became more intense. He found an old diary hidden in a drawer of the antique writing desk. The diary belonged to a woman named Alice, the last occupant of the cottage. Her entries detailed growing paranoia and strange phenomena. Voices whispering in the night, objects moving on their own, and a constant feeling of being watched. The diary ended abruptly, with a final entry describing a desperate attempt to escape from the cottage. Daniel felt a growing sense of dread as he read the entries, realizing that Alice had been driven to madness by the same disturbances he was now experiencing. That night, the disturbances escalated. Daniel was awoken by a cold hand gripping his wrist. He saw shadowy figures moving in the corners of his vision and heard anguished whispers filling the room. He felt trapped in the cottage, as if the walls were closing in on him. By Thursday morning, Daniel was exhausted and terrified. He tried to contact Helen, but his phone had no signal, and the landline in the cottage was dead. The sounds continued, growing louder and more aggressive. The walls seemed to throb with a malevolent energy, and Daniel felt an intense pressure on his chest, as if something was trying to suffocate him. Determined to escape, Daniel packed his belongings and attempted to leave the cottage. However, the doors and windows were inexplicably locked. The once friendly cottage had become a prison, and Daniel was trapped inside. As Daniel struggled to find a way out, he stumbled upon a hidden basement door. Descending into the darkness, he found a room filled with unsettling artifacts, old photographs of the previous occupants, cult symbols, and remnants of rituals. It became clear that the cottage had been a site of dark practices, and the spirits of those who had suffered there were now haunting him. On Friday morning, property manager Helen arrived to check on Daniel. She found the cottage in disarray, and Daniel visibly shaken. He explained his experiences, but Helen's demeanor remained disturbingly calm. Helen revealed that the cottage had a reputation among locals for being cursed. It had been involved in various dark rituals and was said to be haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered there. Dee offered Daniel a sympathetic, distant apology, acknowledging that the warnings were rarely taken seriously. Daniel left the cottage, shaken but relieved to be free. He later learned that Helen had been aware of the supernatural history, but chose to rent out the cottage anyway, hoping to avoid any issues. The story of Daniel's experience became a cautionary tale for those seeking isolation in places with dark pasts. The cottage remained rented out, with its haunting reputation adding to its allure for those drawn to its eerie charm.